Hey guys, today I have for you a mid-century modern walnut dresser that I am going to refinish. The top is in bad shape. The whole entire dresser has this ugly sort of yellowy lacquer factory finish that they put on it. I mean, you can't blame them. They wanted everything to be like one tone, but that is not the vibe today. That is not what we're going for. So we're going to refinish this and take off all of that old ugly lacquer. These handles are really interesting. They're almost like a brushed sort of imitation wood in like a light gray with gold, like brass. So I'm going to keep them original, but we'll see how it turns out. Beautiful solid walnut bar and legs that extend into the sides. I took all the hardware off and let's get to scraping. I have my carbide scraper here. This is the best tool because you don't have to sand all of that finish off. You can just scrape it off and then you can start with your 100 grit underneath and just sort of get it all even and then go through your grits like normal. This saves so much time, especially if you don't want a big wet sticky mess with stripper. And I've had stripper not work and discolor the wood and sort of like bleach it in areas before. So it's just a huge mess. I find this so much easier because you're just creating sort of like dust and you can put this in the garbage and it's not that difficult to deal with. Whereas all of that crazy goo is really annoying. These are all the drawers scraped. The drawers weren't as hard as the top of the dresser because they're just a flat surface. This is what it all looks like when it's scraped. I have 2 scrapers because I got a new one this season and I actually got a replacement blade also. So this is how I set up the dressers when they're large because I need it to be propped up on a little bit of an angle so that I have some leverage while I'm scraping. As you can see, I am just pressing down and pulling and then just sort of going back up lightly and then pressing down and pulling downward. So that's sort of the motion I do like this so that you get a little bit of momentum going because it's a lot more difficult if you had to lift and place the scraper. And if you lift and place the scraper down wrong or too hard, you can sort of gouge the wood with the scraper as it's landing. So I like to keep it touching the wood so that it's sort of just gliding against it on its way back up, or so that it doesn't gouge the wood. I mean, it still happens sometimes, especially in areas like this where it's a little bit more tricky and you have less leverage. So when I get to the edges, I just do as much as I can that I feel like I can do safely. And then the rest of it, I'll just leave like you see here and I'll just sand it off by hand and then with the sander. Because there's sort of like a lip on the edge of this dresser, I couldn't use the scraper to get right in there like I usually do. So I'm just going in with some 100 grit sandpaper and I'm getting as much of that finish off as I can. If there's still a tiny bit, like no one's really going to see it because it will blend by the time you put your stain or your Danish oil on. So I just sort of go and do as much as I can. As you can see, I sort of go in a little quick motion here. I never go against the grain. Please just always go with the grain, even if it's in a difficult area, even if it's tedious, because it's just not worth it. Going against the grain will leave you scratches, even if you think that you got them out. Especially if you're starting with a lower grit, you're going to see those scratches when you put your color on and it's just not going to be pretty. This solid walnut bar that I'm doing now is just great because you can just sort of get in there and get all of that finish off because it's solid. So you can sand off a lot more than you can with these trim pieces that you see above my fingers because those tend to be a bit thinner, especially on the trim and especially on the edges of the trim. So just be really cautious. It looks really good though. It came off like a dream, and I love how this solid walnut extends all the way from the ground up. I have it on its back so that I can scrape the bar here and work on the front of the dresser. I always just move the dresser around. Make it work for you. Just get it in a position where it's easier to work with. Don't try and, crouch down and work with it sideways and all of this stuff. Just lay it down, move it around, put blankets down, put sheets down, put tarps down, and it'll be a lot easier in the long run. Whenever I have little grooves like this, I try to just fold the sandpaper to fit the groove. This came off a lot easier. I probably didn't even need to scrape it, but honestly, you'd be surprised how easily the scraper takes finish off sometimes in comparison to even 100 grit. I'll be sanding and sanding and sanding to get 100 grit off just by hand, but if I use the scraper first, I just have to go over it until it's even in color, and I know I've gotten all of that residual staining from the finish off, and it saves so much time. As you can see, I'm just getting to the curve here. As long as you don't press too hard in really detailed areas like that, you're okay to use the scraper. This bar right underneath the lip, at first I wasn't even sure if it was going to be walnut veneer or if it was just going to be a hardwood underneath. Sometimes on these trim areas, they will use a hardwood and not put a veneer on. Sometimes it's different from the top and the bottom bar. So when you're looking at it, you just really have to scrutinize the grain, because sometimes I've been tricked too and I start to sand it and it's white wood. And when that happens, I either have to try and stain it to match, which it never really works well because the white wood doesn't take the stain to match the same way. Walnut has its own color already, so it just doesn't match well. Usually I'll have to end up painting them. A lot of times too, it's not that big of a deal if you do end up painting areas. It is a lot easier than sanding white wood all the way down, because that lacquer that they have on there ends up staining it, and getting enough of the wood sanded away so that you no longer see the staining from the lacquer through whatever stain you're going to put on is very, very frustrating. So I wouldn't recommend that. I'm just getting in the little detailed areas here. It can be a little bit annoying when there are different cutouts and you have to go against and try not to hit the bar that's going in the other direction below where I'm doing it right now, because I don't want to leave scratches on that bar. So I'm just getting in this little area and I'm just using the corner of the sandpaper. As you can see, I just have a little bit more to work on, but it's getting there. It's looking pretty good. I have it set up to sand the top. As you can see, I have a little fill there from that chip that I showed you in the beginning. And you'll see at the end that you can barely see that thing. I do a lot of grain painting, so I'll just sort of make paint up with the acrylic paints that I have at home. They're just like an art acrylic paint, not a dollar store craft paint, but like a professional artist's acrylic paint. I know you can probably use a refinishing, like furniture refinishing brands paint. It's just what I have, so I've been using it. It's been working really well. So I'll just mix up a custom color that matches the color after I put my Danish oil on, so I know what color I'm going to be working with, and I paint it on, and then it gets sealed with poly with the rest of the dresser, and it works really, really, really well. You can't even see that there was ever like a chip there in the first place. I'm just sanding the edges here, and as you can see, as I'm sanding, I'm being very careful to not leave the sander over the edge where I can't see what's happening for too long. So I'll go over, I'll do a little bit of sanding, and then I'll move it again to check my progress. Because if you leave it there, and it starts to eat through the edge of that veneer, you will be so pissed at yourself. So it's better to just go slow and keep moving it away, because if you can't see, that's when bad things happen. So I'm just checking. It's all looking good. It's all looking smooth. And if you ever feel like the sander is just doing too much, like I have it probably on setting like 1 or something just to make sure it's not going crazy, you can always just take your 100 grit and you can go in by hand for those areas where the finish is left on the edges, and you can just sort of rub the finish away until it is low enough that you feel comfortable just quickly sanding it. I've been doing it for a while now, so I feel more comfortable using the sander on the edges, but it still happens to me. So trust me when I say that it can happen within a split second, especially on corners like this. Because of the angle of the sander, as you're going over the corner, you might think that it's very flat, but the sander is heavy and you're also pressing down a bit. So as it's going over the corner, sometimes the angle changes and it just digs into the corner, and then you're left with a white spot, which you could definitely fill with paint. It's just more the principle of learning how to carefully do the corners. So as you're going back and forth on your open spaces, you want to make sure that you're just going back and forth in lines that are following the grain, and you just want to go slow and steady. You're not going to leave lines if you go against the grain, but I just sort of I do the whole edge first, and then I'll sort of go in like a box pattern, and I go nice and slow, just slow and steady like this, so that you're not leaving swirl marks, especially when you're using your lower grits, like your 100. If you go too fast, which I have done in the past before I sort of knew this, you would just sort of like go back and forth with your arm and you're going really, really quickly. It's really bad. You will see swirl marks, and I don't know exactly the science behind why this happens, but if you don't go slow enough, you will see swirl marks, especially if you're using 100 grit. So please just be very careful because they are so hard to sand out. You almost have to sand them out by hand. I'm just buffing this area for paint later because I'm going to be painting this ledge. I didn't really think it was worth sanding it all the way down to white wood, and I knew it would never match, and I'm not really a fan of the two-tone anymore. I used to do it in the past where if there was white wood that I wanted to sand, I would sand it down all the way, get all of that discoloration out. But even then, there'd be areas that looked patchy because of the discoloration that went very, very deep into the grain, and it just never really looked good. Well, sometimes it did, but most times it was uneven, and I just want to avoid that, so I use like a brown paint. So I'm using the Danish Oil in a golden oak color. You can also just use natural. You can use a dark walnut, black walnut. I thought this dresser would have a beautiful color on its own. Different cuts of walnut veneer will have different tones to them. This one had a beautiful like orangey reddish brown tone, and all it needed was to be showcased. So I kept it natural. Sometimes with lower quality veneer, like I can just tell the build of the dresser is lower quality, I will go in with a dark walnut Danish Oil without even thinking, because usually they're using cuts that are all over the place. So you'll have yellowy, you'll have gray toned, you'll have orange toned, and it just doesn't look as good. So I'll go in with a more pigmented Danish Oil, but most of the time I stick with this natural one. And I think it just really makes the grain pop. And at this stage is where everything starts to come together, because you can see the color of your dresser. And after this Danish Oil is dry, that's when I do my touch-ups on any of the areas that got filled. And I do like a color match to the color that the dresser is going to be, which is this beautiful, beautiful warm brown. That grain just looks amazing. I really like working with Danish Oil. I mean, it's easy to use. It's not sticky. It's not recommended that you do it in the sun. So I always try to make sure I'm in the shade. And it's like it's a very thin product. So it's not like a teak oil. Like I used Watco's teak oil in the past, and it gets really gummy and sticky sometimes if it's too hot out, and it's a little bit difficult to work with. And I mean, this does something very, very similar because it has sort of like solvents in it. So as it like goes into the grain, it hardens, and you can use this as your finish, but you have to build up the coats so that you have more protection. And I just find that sometimes when you put more coats of this Danish Oil on, you can get these weird sort of spots of oil as it's drying, because different areas of the wood sometimes soak up the oil more than others, which I don't really want to happen. So I just go with the recommended instructions, do the coat, and then 30 minutes later you go in and do another coat, and then you take it off after 15 after that. And then I let it dry overnight, and you can tell once it's dry, it doesn't look like this. Like the wood soaks it up. It goes into the grain, so you'll still have areas that look a little bit dry. They're colored, they're nice, but you can tell it's not like a finished product. So that's why I don't just use the Danish Oil, and I end up going in with polyurethane, a wipe-on poly after this process. But that solid wood just looks amazing with this oil, and I'm so happy the color was very even throughout. The cuts were even. The way the graining joined was nice and even. Oh, it just looks so good. This really makes me appreciate like walnut And sometimes I even think that I like working with walnut more than teak for MCM furniture, because you just don't get this experience with teak. I mean, it can be beautiful, and it is beautiful, but that green on the walnut and that just like deep color with the variations and the contrast, that just gets me. So this is all the Danish oil on. You can already see like it's not overly shiny, and it just sucked up all of that product. So now like it's in the grain. I'm using a bit of Restore Finish. I know it's a little bit controversial, but this area of the legs would never really be refinished. It's just white wood underneath, not even like a nice quality wood. There's just some scuffs and stuff, so I just wanted to shine it up and make them look a little nicer again. There's a tiny scratch here, but honestly, like it's a vintage piece. Like it's not gonna be perfect. So, and this is not deep enough that I could actually put like a stain over it, because I'm using the darker walnut Restore Finish. So if that scratch went all the way through to raw wood, it would be colored right now from that Restore Finish that I put on. So just because there are white areas on the areas that aren't walnut underneath does not mean that they are going to be stainable. I have some white paint here. I just wiped off the excess Restore Finish with a cloth after I put it on. The can says to just wipe it off right away, so that's what I usually do. If I need to get off paint or anything like this, I put a little bit of Restore Finish on, and then I take some steel wool and I rub at it. As you can see in the video here, I'm really trying, but I'm also filming with one hand, so I think my angle was just a little bit off, so I sort of went in off camera and tried to get more off, and I did end up getting a little bit more off than I did in the clip here. See, I'm even changing my angle and trying to like push in with my thumb. You have to be careful though if you are using this on a surface that maybe doesn't have as thick of a finish, because as you're rubbing the steel wool, don't forget it is sort of causing like small scuffs and scratches, so like you could end up with like a discolored like lighter area, so just be careful of where you're doing it on. I use the Minwax Wipe On Poly in a satin finish, and I've been using this for years. I really like it. I'm just using a sponge brush here because I find that as I'm going down, if I want more product, I can sort of use my fingers to press into the sponge and it releases more product. I'm just using the edge to go over this part where there might be any drips, because as I'm starting, there's more product deposited in those areas. And honestly, you always have to go back and just check for drippage, because as it's sitting, it likes to move a little bit sometimes. And it might look like it's not even, or that it's dripping, or it looks a little bit like it's going on thicker in certain areas. But I've always just found that as it dries and you do your second and third coat, it evens out. It always looks a lot more streaky when it's wet than when it's completely dry. And then it looks even better as it's had time to set overnight. So sometimes you can't really judge it until the next day. But it always needs at least 2 coats. You can't usually do just 1 coat, because different areas of the wood, like I said before, are going to suck it up more than others, and it is going to be streaky. So at least 2. I usually do 3 or 4 coats on the top of my dressers, just to add protection and also just to create a very even finish, because the top of the dresser is where a bunch of light reflects off of. So everyone's going to see all the streaks if it does look streaky. So I just add a little bit more. And sometimes, you have to add coats until you're happy with the finish. And that's happened to me before, where I've just had to keep adding coats until I'm happy with how it looks. But that's just part of it. It's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to do the top. I just put some product on my brush. I go in and I do a little section. And then as I'm going along, sometimes I'll just add a little bit more to my brush, and then I'll see I added more here, and then I'll continue doing like into the middle, and I'll just use like light brushing strokes as I'm trying to blend the areas that I've just done, because I don't want to start and stop kind of pattern where you can see all the different areas where I started and then stopped and then continued. So I try to go back over it after and do one long continuous stroke. But the poly does not like it if you go to the end and then go back to the beginning and try to do that, because it will start to get matted since it's already starting to set up and dry. So try to be quick, and if you want to fix anything, just try and do it before you reach the end so that you have time still, so it's still wet. I'm just doing the drawer. I always love doing drawers because it's such a small surface area, and the poly just ends up being the most even on the drawers because it doesn't have time to start drying. You can actually do the entire drawer and still go back to the beginning where you started before it even starts to set up. So it's just a nice experience. All the poly's on now. So once it's dry, usually it's 2 to 3 hours. I will take my fine steel wool. That is what I'm using. It is very fine. I think it's a 00. I could be wrong, but I believe it is. And you just buff the entire surface. I'm using some of this natural stone pumice. It comes with this sponge here. You just get it a little bit wet, and it creates almost like this paste just for shining up your hardware. It's all natural. I'm sure there are other products out there. I just have cloth for the excess. So you just want to, since these have the wood on them, I was a little bit stuck here. I had to do very small motions because I didn't want to get it all over the handle because I didn't know if it was going to leave discoloration. I'm just putting the hardware back on. This is pretty nice, simple hardware. I haven't had any problems with it. I'm just painting on this like medium brown color. It's almost like a reddish brown. It looks really good with walnut. It's from the Benjamin Moore Advanced line. I actually bought a color and I didn't end up liking it, so I got them to fix it, so now it's custom, so I apologize, but I really like that line for furniture. It just turned out amazing. It looks so good. This is how I stage it up against my garage, and it just looks amazing. It looks so nice. It just looks like something you would buy in a store. It looks modern. That solid walnut looks amazing. I bought this piece for $100. It also came with a very large elm mirror, which I already sold for $125. I'm hoping to sell this dresser for $900. That's where I filled it. You can't see it. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you liked the process, and let me know if you have any questions.